when you talk about 2019 revolution, there's often a desire to look at it within the context of the Arab Spring. But Sudan is very different from the Arab Spring. Sudan in 2019 was seen as the result of the 30 years of sanctions, which is why when Omar Bashir's government was toppled, the Sudanese people felt they did a revolution, but Washington believed wholeheartedly that Bashir had been toppled as a result of sanctions, that they had squeezed the economy enough to finally force people out onto the streets to topple al-Bashir, and therefore Washington would dictate the terms, not the Sudanese. That it would be Washington who dictate the terms, not the Sudanese, in the way perhaps that the Tunisians had dictated their own transition in Tunisia itself, which is why that the Sudanese were stunned that even after toppling al-Bashir, they could not dictate the terms of the transition agreement. And unless Washington would finance Sudan, none of the other nations would come and finance Sudan itself. The Qataris were not willing to put finances in, neither were the UAE, neither were Saudi Arabia, because they wanted to see changes first take place to the state, as with Washington itself. The next stage was, how do we reconstruct the army? So the UAE from 2019 had been supporting Hemeti and building his RSF, his Rapid Support Forces. So what was supposed to be an auxiliary force ended up a very powerful force. So Hemeti's forces went and fought in Yemen. They went to fight in Libya. They went to fight in other arenas. The UAE training these forces to become like a proper army. And the suggestion was that Washington would agree to the army being dismantled and that the RSF would be the new core on which the army would be built around. Because in Sudan, what al-Bashir had done was, as a result of the sanctions, he built these huge weapons manufacturing factories. And he was able to build his own weapons afterwards. And Netanyahu is on record as having said to the Americans that Sudan needs to be sanctioned. This is about 96, 97. Sudan needs to be sanctioned because the Palestinians are getting their weapons from Sudan itself. So as a result, they believe the army needed to be reconstructed and dismantled, and with the RSF. In 2021, when it came to the time to hand over power to the civilian, of course, the army said, no, absolutely not, because we know what's happening again. So when the leftist parties found it was very difficult to dismantle the army, that's when they asked Hemeti to go and get rid of Burhan. So there was an agreement, even with some elements of the army, that Hemeti would go and assassinate Burhan, take over power, and then dismantle the army and put the RSF as the new core, and then bring these leftist parties into power, and Washington and the UAE would together embark on these ideological changes to the state that the Americans desired and for which they imposed the 30 years of sanctions for. And now there is this war now between the army and between the Rapid Support Forces backed by the UAE. The army made some gains, but then the UAE amplified its support for the RSF. And that's why you see that Washington is very timid in what it says about Sudan, because Washington also believes that the ideological changes it wants to bring to the state is unique to the RSF.